welcome everyone to Semester 2's Transport and Mobility History seminar series. This is the first this semester, and just before we proceed, just going to quickly remind you that our next event is on the 17th of February, and that is going to be a Meet the Archivist event. And we are really pleased to be welcoming an archivist from the National Fairground and Circus Archive. So really looking forward to that. The link has just gone into the chat for you as well to sign up there. But this evening, I'm really delighted to welcome Oliver Betts, who, hold on, has Oliver disappeared? Oh, no, there you are, sorry, moved on my screen. Ollie Betts is a research lead at the National Railway Museum. He's also one of the co-conveners of the seminar, so it's a real pleasure to hear his talk this evening. And Ollie is going to be speaking to us about blind passengers and alternative sensory histories of the railways. And as usual, we will hear the paper. Feel free to start putting questions in the chat, and then we will have further time for questions at the end. So I will hand over to Ollie. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully that's working all right for everyone. Lovely. So thank you, everyone. Just before I start, I want to sort of preface this talk with the fact that this is sort of work that's not connected to any gallery or exhibition, or which is quite a relief for me over the last sort of 6-7 years working at the museum. So it's just research that I've been pursuing, and it means it's been somewhat disrupted by COVID, partly because my wife is clinically vulnerable, so I've not been out to all of the archives that I've liked to have completed this sort of work. So I suppose it just to preface that it's a sort of work in progress, and I'm very, very keen to hear people's ideas and people's thoughts as I go. I also think it's a really interesting sort of story and a mystery. I'm going to just, if it lets me skip on one, right. Oh, there we go. So there's considerable work on passengers in railway history. Charlotte Matheson, Susan Major, Amy Richter's sort of classic study about it that's sort of more orientated around the States. There's lots of work by Colin Duval, there's work by Richard Dennis, and there's earlier work that's sort of the classics of Jack Simmons and Wolfgang Schivelbusch's sort of classic 70s study that was translated from German. So there's enormous sort of literature out there about passengers, but there is no crossover consideration of blind passengers, or really passengers with any particular sort of disability. There is a focus that's emerging, particularly out of the NRM, which is lovely to see, working with Mike Asbester down at Portsmouth, who's one of the co-conveners of this seminar series on railway workers and disability, and that's producing some really fascinating insights. And I know that's been sort of aided by lots of people, some of whom may be here who are the sort of volunteers working on that project. But there hasn't been any sort of big sort of consideration of railway passengers and disability, which is unusual because there's this developing, I think, over the last 5 to 10 years, work on the place of the disabled within industrial society, particularly of the sort of 19th and into the 20th century, and the idea that railway work, sort of the railways are part of this sort of big sort of industrial economic system that's developing, that encompasses lots of people, and that there is a disabled sort of aspect to this that can be drawn out. So what I want to present to you today is a short case study that raises questions about how blind passengers navigated the railways. I'm going to use blind here as a sort of catch-all term. It will almost certainly include people who are partially sighted, who may have some sort of vision in one eye better than the other. It is a sort of, I think nowadays we acknowledge blindness as a spectrum. In the Victorian period, at least in common parlance, you were blind or you weren't. And that's probably more complicated if you were an expert or you were blind yourself in the Victorian period, but I'm using the sort of the labels as they are from the 19th century here. But it just to sort of flag up to people that this will involve people who probably have some limited vision, as well as people who are clinically blind, as we would understand it. So I want to sort of consider how blind passengers navigated the railways, how contemporary languages of passengers' rights, legal rights particularly, but also their sort of intrinsic human rights, which becomes part of the conversation, are deployed versus the idea of risk and liability, particularly legal liability and corporate liability here, by those on either side of the debate, and what this can sort of offer us for railway history more broadly and transport history more broadly. It is the most incredibly short of case studies, I'm afraid. So this is, in one sense, I mean, I've always had a huge admiration for microhistory, and now here I am presenting something which is 4 to 5 months in May to September 1909. So I'm just going to give you the briefest outline of the case, which is firstly that at some point, and a lot of this has to be recreated from, I'm afraid, 19th century newspapers where the dates are a little bit fluid because it's happening so quickly. So at some point in early May 1909, a blind passenger, and frustratingly, it is never named, and I think we will never find out this man's name, unfortunately. I'll come back to that point later on, is refused a ticket at sort of point of sale on the Great Eastern Railway at Fenchurch Street Station, forcing him to sort of spend the rest of his day travelling to his place of employment. His employer, Dr. John Fletcher Little, immediately takes legal advice, more on Fletcher Little later as well, but takes legal advice and also approaches his local MP about the issue. Fairly quickly, the issue is raised in the local and then the national press of discrimination on the Great Eastern Railway, and it follows that sort of classic trajectory of 19th century newspapers where once the local press report on it, the national press have free range to report on the local press's coverage of it, and copy sort of circulates around the various sort of consortia of newspapers. The Board of Trade begins an investigation, and at some point, JFS Gooday, the general manager of the Great Eastern Railway, responds formally to the Board of Trade's inquiry. The Board of Trade investigation is never completed, as far as I can tell, which again is interesting and to do with just how short a time period we're talking about. At some point, the Blind Travellers Defence Committee is formed, possibly towards the sort of end of July 1909, and 600 plus blind people and their sort of supporters form a demonstration in Trafalgar Square out of outrage over this case. There's continued skirmishes in the opinion pages and the letters pages of the local and the national press, of course, throughout this period. And sympathetic MPs are primed to ask questions in the House of Commons. And I emphasize here, sympathetic both to the railway company and to the cause of blind and partially sighted people. And at some point in this process, it is revealed by the then chair of the Board of Trade, Winston Churchill, that the Great Eastern Railway has withdrawn these requirements placed on blind travellers, so that this is a moot issue. He's very happy to sort of announce in the House, and that's where the story ends. So in some ways it's a sort of bang and you'll miss it moment in railway history, but I think it's one that's really worth looking at because of what it can give us. And here on the left is just a nice quick picture of Fenchurch Street roughly at the time. So I think the first question that I wanted to explore was really, why does the Great Eastern Railway put in these restrictions? There's considerable scholarship on railway management, I mean, particularly from David Turner most recently, and railway companies are very aware, corporate citizens, especially by sort of 1900, they're aware of the reputational damage that exists out there. And whilst by sort of 1909, the sort of period where this happens, these are companies at the height of their powers, they're also companies that, as I say, are aware of what's going on. And these restrictions that are put in are quite extreme. I boiled them down here on the right, that essentially they will require a guide to navigate every platform, a sighted guide, a guide to help them change trains at junctions. And it's unclear, and people point this out in the press coverage, it's unclear whether these guides can be the same people or whether two guides are required, one to navigate a platform and one to change a train at a junction. And then the Great Eastern Railway requires them to sign a complicated legal waiver that any accident that might befall a blind traveller was due to their own blindness and not the fault of the railway. And this is picked apart in the press by sort of legal experts and activists. Essentially, it's such an enormously sort of biased legal waiver that apparently if a blind person had been sitting in a carriage that was involved in an accident caused by a mistake at signals or two trains colliding, so for example, nothing to do with their blindness, the severity of the waiver would have meant that that accident could be prescribed to their fault. So it's sort of it's a very poorly written legal waiver, as well as being extremely sort of limiting. And this is sort of thought to essentially be tantamount to a ban. And there's a lot of, I think, questions back and forward about whether this is essentially a ban by another means, or whether this is a genuine attempt to sort of put in restrictions that the Great Eastern Railway sort of want to see. The Great Eastern Railway doesn't appear very much in its own defense in this discussion, which is quite interesting. So often the railway companies were very aware of the sort of battles that could be fought in opinion pages in the newspapers, and sometimes hired people to respond to comments within, for example, big newspapers like the Times. So you would have people write in to correct, for example, sort of people saying, oh, well, you know, the Southern Railway is the sort of the worst railway that has ever existed, and its trains are never on time. And you'd have someone who's a duty manager at the Southern Railway write in and say, well, actually, almost 50% of our trains are on time. So the one quote that you do get, and I think it's a really useful one, so I'm going to read it out in its entirety, if that's right with people, is the one from Gooday, which is submitted to, I think, to the Board of Trade, but is essentially appears in the newspapers repeatedly. Which is, surely no one can expect us to provide attendance to safeguard any of our passengers, whether unfortunately suffering from the infirmity of blindness or any other infirmity that prevents them from taking care of themselves. And equally, surely no one can expect us to allow a totally blind man to travel unprotected at the risk of his life. So I think there's sort of several things going on there, particularly this idea that the railway, on the one hand, it's to allow blind travellers is somehow this terrible imposition on the railway that no one could expect the railways to have to provide attendance at great cost to look after this particular group of passengers, but also that it would be unfair of the railways to adopt a laissez-faire attitude of just letting blind travellers navigate their system unprotected. And you could, I think, read that in a number of ways. You can read that potentially as the Great Eastern Railway trying to cover itself, or I think you can read it in another way, which is about the management of corporate risk. And that's sort of what I want to talk about now. So I've kept the quote up at the top. There's a tremendous amount of research on how risk operates in Victorian society and the ways in which risk and risk taking and risk management is changing, and a lot of this is traced back to the sort of sociologist and thinker Ulrich Beck, whose work, originally in German, translated in 1992 as Risk Society, is a sort of really important text for this. So Beck argues that the 19th century is the start of this time where it's one set against a traditional world. This is his quote: a traditional world of mores and a nature which was to be known and mastered. So the idea that in the 19th century, risk is everywhere, but the 19th century is a time where people start to look to technology to manage risk and to overcome risk. And it's a particularly technologically focused argument from Beck, and this has attracted lots and lots of comments. There's a really interesting, if you're interested in sort of pursuing the ideas of risk more generally, there's a really interesting roundtable in Victorian Review in fall 2014, sort of table by Daniel Martin about this. Martin and others question sort of this idea of Beck, whether this almost jingoistic sort of technological focus on progress is quite right. And sort of this is, I quite like this quote from Martin. So humanities scholarship often prefers to focus on assemblages of local danger and risky phenomena. But if we want to challenge this sort of jingoistic idea that the Victorians are just convinced that technology will let them manage risk, which I think if we think even just about the railways is a very flawed interpretation, then we need to think about interconnectedness of disparate local accidents, disasters, dangers and risks. And if I take anything from Martin in this discussion of risk today, it's this idea of interconnectedness that I want to come back to. So any of us who've worked on the Victorian Railway will know that they're incredibly litigious, and perhaps with good reason. Victorian train travel is incredibly risky for passengers, for railway employees, and for railway companies who are invested in the smooth running and financial returns of their railways. So I want to looking first at why the GER sought to limit its risk. It's either, I think, through an altruistic desire to protect its passengers from harm. The sort of Victorian cynic in me raises an eyebrow at this idea, or a calculated logic to protect itself from legal claims of people who were injured. But I think either way, it allows us to think about how, by extension, blind passengers navigated landscapes of risk themselves, and how risk was interconnected for blind people and sighted passengers on the railways themselves. So if you've never worked with the letters page of a Victorian newspaper that pertains to the railways, I think you have missed a trick as a historian or a scholar, because they are easily the most enjoyable source that you will ever spend time with. Letters to the editors, particularly letters to the editor of the Times as well, the Digital Archive has a lovely way that you can filter just the letters and opinions page, are just fantastic to work with and give you this incredible visual landscape of the railways. So firstly, I want to spend a bit of time now thinking about railway passengers. So Victorian railway passengers had to navigate by 1909 a system that was probably at the biggest sort of extent of its network in terms of complexity, a system that's at this point pushing to higher speeds as well and frequency of service, and one which is still as well juggling large amounts of goods traffic alongside passenger travel as well. Within, and this is I think important for the sort of blind London-based story that we're telling, within a sort of system where urban expansion and suburban rail has become more and more important. So I think we forget that some of the enormous periods of urban growth in Britain are those final decades of the 19th century and the early 20th century, where suburbia fed by the railways, often off the back of railway land that the railways had accumulated in the mid-19th century and are now selling off to developers or developing themselves as housing estates, are really starting to sort of push up the flow of people through particular stations. And you can see this if you search for the name of any railway company. You can see here I've just been searching London, Chatham and Dover here off the back of the Times one, just to give you an idea. You put the name of any railway company and you will start to see the sort of pinch points that have emerged in the sort of railway landscape. And commentators are very aware of the risky points of the railway and the uncomfortable points of the railway. And those two, sort of risk and discomfort, go hand in hand, I think, in the Victorian period. So you've got here, you know, in the later part, this is talking about, I think, Ludgate Hill. So you've got this later part, you've got a staircase where people are struggling, they struggle up the narrow staircase. It is so steep that porters and others carrying boxes and packages, when they lean backwards, are in danger of injuring the persons crowding in behind them. The matter is not improved by the smoking and the spitting which are allowed across the station, which is this in 1871. Further down here, this is again Ludgate Hill. Ludgate Hill becomes one of these sort of pinch points if you travel on the London, Chatham and Dover. Every platform is approached on the network by a staircase, where every staircase abounds in sudden turns. There are many stations approached by staircases which would not be tolerated for a moment if found in theatres. The theatres line is a really interesting one. Victorian readers are inundated with a sort of discussion of risk, danger, and what's happening in modern society. And the theatre reference here is to a number of key accidents that had happened and fires that had happened in theatres in the late 19th century. So this becomes a very popular piece of social anxiety, the idea that fires emerge in theatres, there's a sudden panic for the exits are blocked or crowds stampede and people are killed in the crush. And there's 20 or 30 ones that are sort of famous, as famous as the most famous of railway accidents that prey on people's minds. And this continued anxiety about narrow staircases, crowded, rushing groups is this sort of layers onto a network, a railway network that's already very busy and very tense. So there are lots of interconnectednesses of risk that are happening in the sort of Victorian mind. And I want to emphasize at this point, we are talking about passengers who are fully sighted here. None of these passengers as are blind themselves. This is just a sort of broader risk discussion that is happening. Oh, sorry. You get, so this 1878 one, sometimes these questions are very, very pertinent. They're really amusing, these extracts in the newspapers, but the danger is that you can get into the grain of reading them as contemporary, sort of universal. Sorry, the concern, you know, we're all concerned about crowded staircases, we're all concerned about late trains. It's very amusing to read that people waiting at Denmark Hill were still waiting at Denmark Hill 112 years ago for trains that never quite seem to arrive, and no one seems to know where the train is. One of the sort of things that I always have to remind myself looking at these sources is that these exist in a contemporary moment in time. So whilst amusing, it's worth bearing in mind two things when you read these. It's possible to read these against the grain when bringing into play issues of blindness, and that these letters emphasize a confrontational tone that took place between passengers and the railways. And obviously it's a minority of passengers who write to the editor of the Times to complain about the railways, but it's a very prominent and very vocal minority of passengers. And we know from the railway scrapbooks that we have that the companies kept a close eye on when they were mentioned within the letters pages as well. So there's a sort of, companies by 1900 are aware of this constant confrontation that's happening in newspapers about their services. So this one to the editor of the Times, the editor of Times on the left here is very interesting. He talks about contacting his own MP to ask about whether platforms can be made level with the carriages. And if you know anything about blind passengers at the moment, that's a particularly contemporary concern on the network as well. So this is sort of happening at the time. People are concerned about a lack of access. And then goes on to talk about how this is happening on the continent. You know, if we were building railway stations again, I think it would be very wise to do what they have done in Germany, where they had the advantage of a little pioneering. The continental sort of contrast is always brought up. There's always this imagined other that's better than the British system as well, whether that's true or not. And this constant anxiety about creating a safe and uniform system. And this quote comes up again and again, the idea of a lack of uniformity is inherently unsafe. It creates risk. Differences in the sort of system create risk. The unexpected moments where passengers can come astray, come awry, staircases that are too tight, points that are too crowded, bits where trains collide with each other because buffers are not quite level with the place that they should be, etc., etc. And then on the right here, you've got sometimes the letters as well display this like remarkable lack of self-awareness from the passengers themselves, which must have been infuriating for the railway companies. You hear on the right some about the Great Eastern Rail. I've travelled on this line for the last 35 years, and the majority of its rolling stock leaves much to be desired. The vibration at times is so bad it's almost impossible to read. No attempt is made to heat the compartment. Charlotte Matheson's done lots of work on early passenger experience, about cold, about discomfort, about being treated like they were bundles of freight goods. And it's interesting to see this still happening in 1908, although, as I said at the start, it's also worth bearing in mind that contemporary standards have changed as well. So what a passenger in 1908 thought completely intolerable is not the same as what a passenger in the 1840s would have found completely intolerable. But this also, returning from a weekend trip on the line a short time back, I found out upon entering a compartment on Monday that some waste paper, which I had thrown down the previous Saturday, there's a lack of awareness of, you know, people talk on the one hand about the sort of horror of discarded cigarette butts all over the site, and also the fact that there's nowhere to buy cigarettes on the platform and things like this, you know. But the other thing that I want to sort of emphasize about these sources is that these are all from cited individuals, unless they were for this particular moment in 1909 that I'll come back to in a minute. But you can read these against the grain in an interesting way. So the discussion in this last one on the Great Eastern Railway, just a year before our case in 1909, about rolling stock that vibrates so badly it's impossible to read, cold, but also waste everywhere, getting in the way, underfoot, in sort of places where it shouldn't be. Those are sort of uncomfortable for a sighted passenger and potentially hazardous for a passenger who is navigating that network without sight. So in the absence of blind accounts themselves, there's something to be said for reading these accounts with an eye to understanding where sort of points of tension might come. So it's possible, as I say, it's possible to read these as amusing contemporary complaints, but also we need to set them in this specific context. So the specific context of 1909 is a really interesting one. So in 1908, the year before the Great Eastern Railway brings in this very strange ruling about blind passengers, 1908 is an exceptional year because no members of the public are killed anywhere on the network across Britain. And this is something that firstly is in contrast to every other year, and something that produces absolute amazement in the press. So there's lots of press commentary. The Board of Trade released these sort of statistics every year about passengers and workers who are injured and killed, and trespassers who are injured and killed on the network. And suddenly in 1908, there's a year where no passengers are killed. Still thousands of workers are killed and thousands of trespassers are killed, but there's a statistical anomaly. Now, if we were to read this as Beck and see this as part of a sort of technological system of managing risk, we would expect to see this celebrated as the triumph of new safety equipment, new ways of double checking and reassuring ourselves, and new procedures of managing safety. That's not how it comes across in the press at the time. The Board of Trade has to defend its statistics because people are just so surprised that no one has died across the network. And the idea isn't that this is one sort of wonderful thing that should be aspired to, but is a troublingly low statistic that points to the Board of Trade not being able to add up its numbers correctly. So there is just an expectation in 1908, 1909 that people are going to die on the railway network, that passengers are going to be fatally killed or horrendously injured in the sort of nature of going about their business. So that's the context, I think, that I want to sort of emphasize here. What about the blind themselves then? It is very difficult to get at the voices of the blind themselves in this narrative, and it is absolutely frustrating. They are caught between the conventions of charity and allyship on the one hand, and on the other, a desire to fight for their rights legally and socially. So John Fletcher Little, who's the employer whose blind worker is barred from access at Fenchurch Street, is a really good example of this. So John Fletcher Little is a medical doctor. He's a progressive. He's a representative on the London County Council. He's a failed Liberal candidate for MP. So he is someone who has significant pull in Edwardian society. He knows how to operate the levers of power, essentially, and has friends in high places. And he just happens to be someone who is employing this unnamed passenger at Fenchurch Street as a masseur in his medical surgery. I got quite lost in the research on this. Fletcher Little is fascinating. If you are a medical historian, he is your next monograph topic, because he's got all sorts of strange medical ideas about diet and about, I had about 15 minutes of that and I thought, no, this isn't relevant at all, but it is utterly fascinating. So if you fancy getting lost in a sort of discussion, Fletcher Little is your man. So Fletcher Little is exactly this. He is sighted, but he's an ally of the blind, and he sort of takes it upon himself to shoulder the sort of legal challenge that this is. So he writes, and you've got an extract of it here, this very, very strongly worded, very legally aware letter to the editor of the Times. I've cut bits of it out. There's a bit where he quotes directly from common law as to, you know, the sort of reasons why this is unlawful, and he sort of, you know, it's very strident as well. So in order to maintain the existing rights of the blind, we must carry the war into the enemy's camp. We will attack. Attack will be the most efficient. I will appeal to every member of the House who is not a slave of a railway company to block every railway bill. They have this wonderful idea that they want to insert this clause before the reading of any railway bill, that if a blind passenger wishes to be accompanied by a guardian, attendant or guide, that the guardian, attendant or guide will be carried free of charge. And they have this idea that this is happening in Australia. I'm not sure this is happening in Australia actually, but Fletcher Little has this idea that's happening in Australia and thinks it sounds really good. So that's going to be inserted. So he's someone who takes it upon himself to speak for the blind. One of the things that you find very quickly in doing this history is that there are lots of cited experts, and perhaps I'm wary about putting, post-Trump, I'm wary about putting the word experts in sort of inverted commas, but experts with a question mark to it, I suppose, who speak on behalf of the blind. And I think there's a really interesting PhD thesis written in 2011 by John Philip Oliphant, and which argues that London is a sort of nexus point for this. So this case could only have happened in London, which is a really interesting argument, that because London has really started to educate blind children systemically rather than just randomly as to who happens to acquire charitable sort of patrons. It's a huge investor in raised type, as we now understand, sort of Braille books and Braille pamphlets and things. And it's the only place in the country that's really got significant facilities to support blind education and blind sort of people in society beyond just charitably handing out money and hoping for the best. And as you see here, there are a lot, but that also comes with lots and lots of people who take it upon themselves to speak on behalf of the blind. So stepping back from people like Fletcher Little and finding the voices of blind passengers themselves is really hard. The one place that we're able to do this in the course of the couple of months, and I emphasize here that it's just a couple of months that we're covering, is the Blind Travellers Defence League, its first and I think only meeting that it holds, because it wins its case. There's discussion here. As you can see, Fletcher Little is the chairman of the meeting. The sort of vice chair is the manager of the London School for the Blind, and the recording secretary is the manager of the Edinburgh School for the Blind, all three men who are fully sighted. So what happens? What's revealed, though, in this brief exchange of a couple of months, is that blind passengers were not only a significant presence on the railways, if very much in a minority, but despite the fact that we don't always hear their voices very often, they are able to stand up for their rights quite effectively. The Blind Travellers Defence League forms within a month of the original complaint, possibly as early as the end of June, but it's definitely in existence by the end of July, when they hold this rally in Trafalgar Square, in a short period before the GER scraps these restrictions placed upon it. So Matthias Rees, who's written his book on the National League of the Blind in Great Britain and Ireland, which is like a wider national group, which again fights for blind people's rights, tellingly titled it Blind Workers Against Charity. And this sums up both the league he studies and in many ways the Blind Travellers Defence League's position on this. And that becomes the sort of core thing if we want to try and trace blind people's voices themselves on this. Rees argues that sort of the activism that you see in the early 20th century was born out of a growing desire of blind people to be part of modern society. And clearly, I think by extension then, the ability to travel on the railway unhindered for blind contemporaries is a fundamental part of being involved in modern society. You know, this is one of the sort of linchpins of being quote unquote normal within the system. Narratives presented in the debate at the Blind Travellers Defence League, which like a lot of contemporary meetings is covered essentially verbatim in the newspapers, focuses on this aspect. in his letter to the Times, Fletcher Little both complained that having to provide these sort of sighted guardians would eat into the meagre earnings of blind wage earners, but also argued that chaperones weren't needed because blind people were both able to navigate the network themselves, but also were shown a natural solicitude by ordinary passers-by. And this, I think, what's really interesting is if you read the coverage of the Blind Travellers Defence League meeting very, very closely, is where the sighted and the unsighted narratives start to slightly diverge. So on the one hand, people like Fletcher Little argue that there's this sort of lingering idea that blind people are sort of the recipients of emotional charity as well. So you don't need to provide guardians because everyone's looking out for blind people. On the sort of blind perspective of this, it becomes really interesting. You get a number of people who write in or leave their comments that they don't need it because the blind people don't take the risks that sighted people do. So Canon Gedge, rector of Gravesend, who stated that, this is the newspaper's words, he was completely stone blind, it's a perfectly easy thing to enter and leave railway carriages, trains, etc. And has been travelling for 24 years on the railways completely unaided. So on the one hand, the idea that blind people are completely able to do this and this restrictions are nonsense. Other blind voices speak at the meeting argue that blind people do not take the risks that sighted people take. So the blind man, as it's quoted here, the blind does not run for trains or enter or leave them while they're moving. And that is notoriously the most common cause of individual mishaps in railway travel. And we know from everything from petty court summons to accident books held by the railways that that's exactly the case. And that receives a lot of press coverage, the idea that it's always people who run for trains who end up sort of injuring themselves. British insurance companies have come to recognise the fact that the insurance of blind people is an ordinary risk, which doesn't entail a prohibitive premium. And so this idea of ordinary risk is really, really interesting. So it's indicative of broader narratives and conflicts in the treatment of the blind. Rees, David Turner's work on disabled Britons in the period, and this sort of idea that you have to balance between natural sympathy and charity and newer conversations that are emerging about rights and privileges in a modern state, exemplified by wider debates about social, culture and political reform at the time. Risks that are distinctly ordinary, something that insurers should realise, were an attempt to adopt the sort of prevailing legal languages of risk. In contrast to Beck, one that saw technology not as a mitigator or a solution to risks. Blind people were not arguing, for example, that actually railways were safer than walking on the street or using a horse and carriage, for example, but that something that could easily be folded into the everyday risk that a blind person took leaving the house just generally. And I think that's possibly the most interesting thing that comes out of this brief debate, is the idea on the one hand that the GER sees this as an extraordinary risk for people to take, that sighted allies like Fletcher Little and the chairman of the sort of schools of the blind see these as risks with a capital R that need to be mitigated, but not in the way that the GER sees it. And that blind passengers themselves, when they get the chance to speak in the narrative, see these as risks with a small r, which are just part and parcel of being a blind person and something that they wish to take upon themselves as part of the sort of process of being within normal modern society as they see it. I think I want to mention two things coming off the back of this. So firstly, there is this extensive network of activism that picks up this story, and I think is something that I'm going to continue picking up at and picking upon. It doesn't fully mobilize before the GER pulls its restrictions in September 1909, but some of these press cuttings, this sort of very yellowed one on the left here, only survived because they were digitized as part of a collection of press cuttings book held by the Perkins School for the Blind in Massachusetts, which is the school, for example, amongst others, where Helen Keller is educated. And that's, I think, really interesting that you've got schools for the blind across the sort of Anglophone world picking up this story, clipping this story, remembering this story for future events, and it is wheeled out later on. Secondly, throughout this, there is this discussion is entirely focused on men. I'd initially thought this was just a general Edwardian conceit of gendering the sort of discussion of the passenger as man, but reading back over it for putting the presentation together, it seems the discussion is a lot more pointed. This is about blind men for all participants, whether they are blind men themselves or sort of sighted people pro and con. They are the potential travellers, the potential earners, and the potential risk takers imagined by both supporters and railway companies, railway insurers, etc., etc. The absence of an idea of a blind female passenger is a really interesting one, and something I want to explore more fully at a future date, but it does not enter into discussion at all here. And I think that probably is also tied to the idea of what is happening in blind education at the time, which is a heavy emphasis on making blind men economically useful and economically sort of self-sufficient. So, some brief concluding remarks off the back of a flash in the pan of 4 or 5. I mean, why have I taken you through this slightly rambling journey through a couple of months in 1909 that ultimately didn't get anywhere because the GER got cold feet and pulled its own restrictions? It's partly because these are the only ways that we can get at the voices of blind travelers. Only when it becomes a wider issue that the press becomes heavily invested in can we start to see these sort of discussions emerge in Edwardian and Victorian society. Secondly, because it adds a new
I think, oh, right. Unfortunately, we have lost Ollie. Oh, he's rejoined. Good, because I really wanted to hear you. Ollie, you're back. Oh, you're muted though. You're still muted, sorry.
Sorry,
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Sorry, let me just share my screen.
That's okay. Yeah, I think you were just sort of just getting onto this final slide. So
yeah. I'm really sorry. I'll
resume because it was fascinating. So go.
I'm so sorry. I'll sum up now. I'll try and retain my train of thought, no pun intended. So there is a sort of really interesting way of trying to get at this history. Is there a wider history of this? What I said was at the start, I wanted to think about what the applicability of 4 months in 1909 means to the sort of wider study of railway history. There is yet to be a good academic study of disabled passengers, or and here we get into the sort of the troubled Victorian landscape of what is and isn't disabled, what is and isn't chronically ill. This a weird catch-all term that the Victorians use of invalid as well. There is yet to be the sort of the proper study of the invalid's coach, for example. There's been some very, very good enthusiast sort of publications about the construction and maintenance and use of invalid coaches, but nothing that sort of considers them within that wider context that's emerged in the last 10 years of disability studies. You've got this little thing, the general rule is that you have to pay 4 first-class tickets and 4 third-class tickets to use the invalid's coach, unless you're on the Great Western, where you will only need to purchase 6 first-class tickets. So there's a sort of class dimension to the invalid carriage as well. The museum has at least a dozen of these lovely invalid chairs, which say a lot, I think, about navigating railway spaces. But also, if you think back to that slide I had about narrow staircases at Ludgate Hill, speak about the barriers that have happened to sort of disabled travellers. And I think So I think it supposes, as I was putting this presentation together, that we need to do new ways of approaching railway history if we're interested in, and transport history if we're interested in these questions. As I was putting this presentation together, which is about how the Great Eastern Railway essentially underestimated and took it upon itself to decide what was dangerous and not dangerous for blind passengers, I was very aware that I was making assumed judgments about what I thought was safe and unsafe for blind passengers on the railway as well. Is this something, I wrote down, that a sighted historian should be doing on his or her own? Stereotyping of obstacles, isn't that what this very case is about? So I think as I take this forward, I'm very keen to think about ways of collaboratively researching this, and thinking about how the problems of blind users on today's network, which, as we remember, still incorporates a lot of the physical spaces of the Victorian Railway and the Edwardian Railway 100 plus years ago, affects what we're doing today. So those questions about overcrowded staircases, unlevel platforms, dangerous things underfoot, but also those questions about companies misappropriating or misunderstanding, or I think there's a remaining question in my mind about, is the Great Eastern Railway thinking it's doing the right thing here? It certainly argues that it thinks it's doing the right thing, but whether that's the sort of fool's errand or not, I'm not sure. So it comes down to a sort of pondering conclusion, I'm afraid, rather than a really sort of strong conclusion. But I hope you've enjoyed following through four random months in 1909 with me. I welcome any comments, suggestions, corrections, and as I say, I'm sorry for the sort of slightly rambling nature of this presentation, but as I say, it's sort of ongoing research that's been interrupted time and again by, as I'm sure we're all aware, like a pandemic that doesn't quite seem to want to ease off just yet. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ollie. That was absolutely fascinating, and what you sort of managed to unfold from, such that short time period, so really important questions, and some really thoughtful questions as well, I think, to reflect more widely on the discipline, as well as just lots of fascinating questions about the actual sort of experience itself that was opened up. So thank you so much.